This is going to be our next to last video in the series over a new nation before we engage in our debate. So, during his second term, Jefferson's going to have to handle challenges to the unity of the federal government and to the U.S. position of neutrality in foreign affairs, which is nothing new because we've been looking at that through Washington's presidency and also through Adams. So, the Burr conspiracy proved a particularly high and unusual threat. Aaron Burr, who had killed Alexander Hamilton in an 1804 duel, is going to try to garner the support of the British, the French, and the Spanish governments against the United States. He raised his own military force and tried to recruit members from within the U.S. While Burr's true motives remain unclear, he appeared interested in taking the West from the U.S. government and governing it for himself. General James Wilkinson, who was the governor of the Louisiana Territory and one of Burr's supposed allies, is the one that exposed this conspiracy. Burr's going to go on trial for treason. However, Chief Justice John Marshall's narrow interpretation of treason is going to result in Burr's acquittal. Jefferson's going to try to keep the U.S. neutral in the war between Britain and France, so he's going to try to maintain that policy of neutrality set forth by Washington. The war between Britain and France began in 1803, and unwilling to let the Americans trade boost the French war effort and in need of sailors to staff its fleet, the British are going to continue to seize American ships and to capture sailors on board who had either left or deserted the British Navy. This practice is known as impressment. And some Americans who couldn't prove their identities will also be taken and forced to serve on these British ships. So in June of 1807, the British ship, the Leopard, attacked the American ship Chesapeake after the Chesapeake's captain refused to let British soldiers on board to search for these deserters. So Jefferson faced the option of declaring war on Britain, but he deemed the U.S. military unprepared for conflict of this magnitude. Also, remember Jefferson's stance on the military is that we shouldn't spend a lot of money on the military and therefore, as a result, had a very small military. So instead, he's going to get Congress to pass the Embargo Act, which prohibited American ships from entering foreign ports and therefore stopped the U.S. from reaching Britain or France. Well, the Embargo Act hurts the U.S. economy much more than it hurts the economies of Britain or France. And it's not going to succeed in encouraging Britain and France to stop their fighting, and Congress is going to repeal it in March of 1809. Jefferson's support of the act proved a departure from his stance in favor of limited government, as he had to actively enforce the embargo against the wishes of most Americans. Jefferson chose not to run for re-election in 1808. Remember, he took that precedent, the following in the actions of Washington, only serving for 2 terms, and James Madison is going to become the 4th president of the United States. Well, Madison's going to inherit the difficulties that Jefferson felt during his presidency, which is going to eventually result in war. So during Madison's administration, the country is going to continue to have a difficult relationship with the British and the French navies. Both countries are going to continue to attack our ships. And after repealing the Embargo Act, Congress is going to pass the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. And this act allowed American merchant ships to trade with any country except Britain and France. And like the Embargo Act, it's going to be unsuccessful in effectively damaging British and French trade. Congress then passed Macon's Bill number 2 in 1810, and this is going to remove all restrictions on trade and give incentives to Britain and France to stop seizing American merchant ships. This specifically says that if Britain or France will stop attacking American ships, then the U.S. would stop trading with the other. So if you'll stop attacking our ships, then we'll stop trading with France and we'll solely trade with you, which looks a whole lot like allying yourself with someone to me. Napoleon's going to take advantage of this opportunity to trick the United States into thinking that France had decided to end its interference with American trade. France continued to block American ships even after Madison had ended trade with Britain, and as a consequence, the American public becomes even more angry and distrustful of France. And the public's distrust of Britain increased as well, particularly as rumors spread that the British were attempting to organize Native Americans in the West to rise up against the United States. We know that the British were still there, They had been ordered to abandon their forts in the West after the Revolutionary War that ended in 1783, but here we are in 1810, and the British are still occupying those forts. Well, during the early 19th century, settlers increasingly are going to flock to the western frontier of the United States. The U.S. had claimed the Northwest Territory since 1787. And if you look at where my cursor is right there, that's the Northwest Territory. After Ohio became a state in 1803, the federal government is going to divide the rest of the Northwest Territory into the Michigan Territory, the Illinois Territory, and the Indiana Territory. It established the Mississippi Territory, which is most of present-day Mississippi and Alabama. You can see that down here. And that was established in 1804. While much of the region west of the Rocky Mountains remains under Spanish control, the newly purchased Louisiana Territory, remember we purchased it in 1803 from the French, is going to be a distant frontier that the U.S. intended to one day settle. So this belongs to Spain, and all of this vast territory out here is largely unsettled. So many Easterners are going to hope that the country would one day stretch across the continent to the Pacific Ocean because they're going to want to increasingly occupy that territory. Well, as the nation grows rapidly and we expand westward, Native Americans are going to become increasingly squeezed out of their original lands. In 1790, most of the nearly 4 million white Americans lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. By 1840, 500,000 white Americans lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. And if we go back and look at this map here, that means in 1790, most of us lived here. By 1840, the majority of us are going to live in this territory and beyond. Just to give you a frame of reference there. The Native American population living east of the Mississippi River is gonna fall pretty drastically from about 120,000 to about 30,000 by 1840. So the Washington administration had issued statements suggesting that Native Americans should be allowed to remain on their tribal lands. Increasing westward settlement, however, is going to bring pressure to the federal government to force these Native Americans off their homelands. After the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson hopes that Native Americans would settle in the newly acquired territory to farm with the whites. But again, think about Native American culture. A lot of them weren't ones that settled down and farmed. If they lived on the plains or if they were nomadic, then the settling and the farming and building the fence around my territory is going to go against what their culture calls for, and so it's not going to work the way the government would hope that it would. And so many Eastern Native Americans are going to move westward onto these lands, which other Native American tribes already occupy, which is going to compound the problem. But they're not going to do so voluntarily. In our next section, we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, and we'll look at the stance he takes on the Indians and the results of that. But the government's going to force these tribes to sign treaties to give up rights to their land. A lot of times the treaties were written in English. All the treaties were written in English, and they didn't really know what they were signing. The Shawnee tribe had originally spanned much of present-day Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, western Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And by the early 19th century, treaties meant to facilitate white settlement are going to force many of these Shawnee Indians to move west. Some Shawnees are going to resist increasing pressure to meet these demands of the white people and conform to their laws and customs. One Shawnee chief, who becomes known as the Prophet, led a religious revival, rejecting accommodation to whites and ceding any more land to the U.S. His brother, Tecumseh, became a political leader of the Shawnee Indians who did not want to bend to U.S. pressure. He traveled amongst the Shawnee and other Native Americans, encouraging them to join the resistance against the U.S. government. In particular, he was angry about a treaty that many Shawnee had signed, selling approximately 3 million acres to U.S. William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of the Indiana Territory, and had presented this treaty to Fort Wayne to the Shawnee. And Harrison had, as one of his main missions as governor, to acquire as much Native American land as possible. So in November of 1811, Harrison's going to lead over 1,000 troops to a location near battleground in present-day Indiana. There he's going to meet with the prophet and a group of his followers. Tecumseh had gone down south trying to recruit new members, so he wasn't even there when this happens. So the prophet and his men attack Harrison's encampment on the night of November 6th, and Harrison and his troops win the battle. And this sends the prophet and his Shawnee forces into retreat, and he burns their village to the ground. So this skirmish is known as the Battle of Tippecanoe, and it's gonna strengthen Tecumseh's resolve against the United States. He's going to ally himself with the British and provide large numbers of troops for them in the War of 1812. As a result of this conflict, and we call in history the Battle of Tippecanoe. Later, we're going to talk about when William Henry Harrison is elected as President of the United States, and his campaign slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. His vice president will be John Tyler.